come to interval 7, which is the Bhagavad Gita. And I have always selected the Bhagavad Gita as the intervaling interface between history and science. Science emerges from historical consciousness, and without engendering historical consciousness, there is no form for science. There's no form of science. So that science is the form that emerges out of history. And thus history is a process, and science is a form. But in a way, it's the form of all forms, because the objectivity of science concerns the entire realm of objectivity, and we still use the Greek term cosmos for that. It is difficult to understand unless one has had our phase learning how all of this coordinates and how all of it happens, and that the complexity is not one of confusion, but is one of splendor. And the Bhagavad Gita is one of those points of literature on our planet where everything comes within reach in one very short presentation. The Bhagavad Gita itself is only 18 chapters long. And in translation, here's the old Penguin Classic translation of the Spanish mystic Juan Mascaro. It begins on page 43 and goes to page 122, so it's only 60 pages long in standard paperback English format, and those pages are not filled completely. But the Bhagavad Gita has a coordination to it which needs to be both understood and appreciated. And the coordination is this, and this is true of everything and of all things. Structure is definitely formal, but in order for structures to relate, they must have a relational flow which is of a difference from the structure. And so relational flows are strategies. You can call them processes, but in terms of form and process, one would then use the paired terms structure and strategy. The structure is what its stable form is. The strategy is the dynamic relationality that delivers the wholeness of it. The structure is the details and how they fit together formally and secure stability, whereas the strategy is the overall and underneath traction of how the relationalities of it come together. Without the strategies of vision as a process, the mind is unable to fill out and transforms the structure of the mind. If the mind is only emerged from experience, from mythic experience, so that the symbols come out of myth, the phase of symbols comes out of the phase of myth, the structure of symbols comes out of the strategy of experience, the mind is in that mode integral, but simply integral. It will only integrate. It will only bring together, and meaning will be limited to an integral mode. So that the meaning will be brought together in ideas, and the images will be brought together in the imagination, and feelings will be brought together through the strategies and dynamic of language into the memory in the mind. So that the mind will have a structure, and it will be a very clear structure, and it will have a center to its structure, so that one will be able eventually to have a geometry of intelligence that has an apex of its entire structural integrity. And that center of the mind will be the point and center of the whole ecology of the natural process leading to our individual minds. But we've seen with our learning that the visionary process is a differential. It opens up. And so what was the apex of the mind now becomes a different quality from a final point to a portal through which you get this hourglass effect, that everything that integrated now has a possibility of having an unfolding in increasing possibilities, the differential mode. And we've seen that not only is vision a differential mode process, but history as well is a differential mode process. And so the forms that come out of the unfolding have a different quality. The forms that are integral, like the ritual body or the symbolic mind, are capable of geometric alignments. Their structures are cognate. And you can have one within the other, and the inner one controlling the tightening of the structure and heightening the relationality of the strategy so that meaning develops in the mind, and that the meaning comes together in ideas, in the imagination, in the memory, and language is able increasingly to come to a very fine point of expressiveness, but purely integral language depends for its expressiveness on an ability to do something that in the natural ecology is not normally possible, and that is the symbolic mind must be able to symbolize language. And the way that one symbolizes language is by writing it. And so a written language is the watershed of the mind, and yet it cannot do this naturally. And so there is a natural mystery that is there in the symbolic mind, that in order for it to complete itself, it has to go beyond its natural capacities. And this is one of the triggers that releases consciousness. That visionary consciousness not only develops from the mind and through the mind, so that it goes further in a cardinal way, but it also has not a regressive, but it has a recursive quality, because differential processes are not only progressive, but they are at the same time recursive. They go forwards and backwards at the same time. The backwards is not a repression, it's a recursive function. And so visionary consciousness, by a little bit of its recursive function, is able to come back into the mind and allow for the development of symbols to become a foundation for a written language. And so in all human populations where literacy developed, the ability to read written symbols as a language, was always considered an event of the highest magical order. And that while for not just millennia, but for tens of hundreds of millennia, we were capable of speech, we only became capable of symbolic writing quite recently. And it reached its apex in its first initial mode about 3000 BC. And you find about 3000 BC that everywhere that there are old, ancient cultures on the planet, they develop a new quality of having not just cultures, but of civilization. And four of the great civilized developments around 3000 BC are China, India, Mesopotamia, Sumer, Akkad, and Egypt. In Egypt, you get the first dynasty, 3000 BC, Narmer, or sometimes called Menes. In Mesopotamia, you get the transition from the Sumerian city-states to the beginnings of the confederation of all these city-states into a new kingdom of kingdoms. And out of that comes Sumer Akkad. In China, you get the beginnings of the realization of the written symbolic structure of the consciousness of all of the natural strategies and the time-honored figures that occupy about 3000 BC in China are Fu Xi and his paired consort, Nu Gua. And Fu Xi and Nu Gua make the beginnings of what becomes the I Ching, of what becomes Chinese civilization. Not dynastic, because dynastic China didn't begin until about 2200 BC, some 800 years later. So that Chinese civilization is not founded on dynasties, but founded on the I Ching and its initial symbolic emergence. And of course, out of Fu Xi and Nu Gua come the trigrams that later on will be put together as the hexagrams that will be the structure of the I Ching. In India, about 3000 BC, is an enormous watershed, just like Egypt or Mesopotamia or China, and it is the beginnings of Indian civilization. And that Indian civilization changes in such a radical way that the land itself undergoes a massive transformation. Now, India, as a subcontinent, geologic ages ago, broke off from the Ur-Ganawanda continent of 500 million years ago and smashed against the rest of it, pushing the Himalaya mountains up. And so India is literally an arrowhead that backs itself into the mass of the Eurasian mass and creates the Himalayan mountains, out of which all of the precipitation and snows make all the great rivers that come down and make life in India possible. Now, it's a very curious thing, but the two largest rivers in the Indian subcontinent are the Ganges and the Brahmaputra. And it's interesting because the Ganges and Brahmaputra start from the very same lake in the mountains, in the Himalayas, and that lake is called Manasawar. And it's a very huge, deep, cold mountain cirque lake, and right behind it is one of the most grand sacred mountains in the world called Mount Kailas. And that Kailas is reflected sometimes in Manasawar, and because Kailas is almost a symmetrical, massive dome, the reflection also is a inverted, massive dome, and one gets the ancient diamond of the earthly mountain and its heavenly reflection, because the reflection is not just in the lake, but the lake reflects the sky, and so the reflection of the mountain in the lake is also its celestial image as well. And so in India, ancient yogis have always gone to the Himalaya. Its initial destination was that when you had finished all of your duties of life and you've gone through all the stages of life, of being born, of being a child, of maturing, of marrying and raising a family, having a business, doing your life, and then coming to the beginnings of old age, before you were decrepit, you took yourself out of the life that you had been in, out of the pattern that you had been in, and you committed yourself to beginning to acquaint yourself with the celestial beyond that you soon would be going to. But not everyone could do this. And so there were very few rare individuals, mostly men, who did this, and they became the mountain sages. And they stayed in the Himalayas. And from time to time, there would be younger men who would have suffered traumas or tragedies in their lives, and they would go to these mountain retreats, because growing around some of these sages were little communities of seekers. And very rarely would one of these seekers come back out of the mountains and come back down into the plains, where the Ganges and the Brahmaputra and several other large rivers made India, made the life of the people. About 3000 BC, the Ganges, which is the most massive river in India, changed its course. It had for a long time been the border of two really powerful kingdoms facing each other on different banks of the Ganges, and the Ganges shifted its course to the west and stranded one of these cities a long ways away from the Ganges and drowned the other one, so that they had to move their capital and their whole sense of kingdom further to the west, which brought them into conflict with people already having a kingdom in the west and also in the north. And so you began to get this massive, all of a sudden, juggling of desperate kingdoms wanting to reoccupy, and you got culture wars and kingdom wars on a scale that had never been seen before. And because it involved almost everyone in that northern swath of the Ganges of India, the war that resulted was called the Great Indian War. Maha, great, Bharata, the ancient name for India was Bharat, the Great India War, the Mahabharata. But the Mahabharata, though its events date from 3102 BC, was like the Homeric epics, was originally just an oral delivery, an oral way of telling it, and there were different versions, and through several thousand years, the oral epic cycles of the Mahabharata were passed down until they came to about 300 BC, where it was possible for the first time to write the Sanskrit down. That the written Sanskrit symbols were, for the first time, sophisticated enough and refined enough, plentiful enough, to allow not just for clumsy writing, and not just for cursorial writing, but for great, epic poetry to be written beautifully and precisely. And the man who was the poet sage who lived at that interface was named Vyasa. His full name is Krishna Dvaipayana Vyasa. And he is the sage who writes the Mahabharata as we have it. And the Mahabharata as we have it from him is 18 sections called Parvans. And those 18 sections split into a triad of 3 sections of 6 Parvans each. And as he was an ancient sage who knew about warfare, because noble men were always taught the art of war. It was the only way to sustain a kingdom under competing kingdoms for millennia. So that Vyasa, being a noble poet sage, also understood warfare, and he understood that in order to throw a spear, you must grab it 2/3 back from its point. You don't balance the spear in your hand in the middle. You balance the spear where you're throwing will have its leverage, and for that you grab it 2/3 back. And so if you're 2/3 from one end, which is the point of it all, and 2/3 from the butt, which is the beginning point of it all, and if you have an 18-section sequence, that means that the first 6, where they end and where the 7th begins, is exactly the point at which you balance it to throw it to get to its purpose. And so in the Mahabharata, the 6th Parvan is the Bhagavad Gita, which when it is finished, you are now in possession of the point of the development where you could grasp the meaning so that you could throw it and get to the point. And so the Bhagavad Gita itself, because it is a harmonic chord of the entire Mahabharata, has 18 chapters and has a resonance of structure like the Mahabharata has. So that the 18 chapters of the Bhagavad Gita can be segmented, the first 6, the middle 6, and the third 6. And what's interesting is that the first 6 are all about the yoga of duty. It is a masterpiece of succinct presentation of what is called karma yoga. That these are the rituals that we do, these are the actions that we do, these are the exact details, the exact sequences, and when we do these sequences, this objectivity happens. This is established. This is now there. But the last 6 have a completely different nature from the first 6. Where the first 6 are about karma yoga, the third 6 have a completely different yoga, but one that can not be gotten to right away. Because you have to go through the middle 6 in order to get to the final 6. Otherwise, that yoga not only is not understandable, it does not occur. So it is nowhere to be found. Because it will take place in the mind. But the mind does not have a space that has enough strategy and enough structure to let it be real. And so it doesn't exist. It has to be created. And so the middle 6 are about how one creates that strategy of space in the mind and that structure of time in the mind to allow in that time space something to happen that would not be able to happen otherwise. And so the middle 6 are not about karma yoga. They have a different quality to them. They're a transition. They're a way of leading from karma to something else, what is coming after it, the form that will come after it. So at the middle 6 of the Bhagavad Gita are very, very strange. And if one turns, I once outlined in a lecture series an American reading of the Bhagavad Gita, and when one comes to a typical comment of Bhagavad Gita chapter 7, one of the great scholars of it, his Oxford edition of the Bhagavad Gita is world famous, R.C. Zaehner, one of the great writers on Zarathustra, on sacred and profane mysticism, number of things. Zaehner says, this chapter is certainly the most confused in the whole of the Gita. This chapter has little connection with the last. And what he's talking about is the way in which chapter 7 has come to chapter 12 and has made a section, an end of a section, but how do you get to chapter 13? How do you make this leap? That chapter 7 was very peculiar, but one could begin to figure it out. But the last 6, there's something else going on here. The key to it is to understand that in addition to the structure, there is a strategy of relationality. And in ancient India, the relationality dealt with 2 different modes. One was the natural mode, and the Sanskrit word was prakriti. Usually, when I was first delivering presentations on the Bhagavad Gita about 35 years ago, I used to call her Ma Prakriti, Mother Nature. She cares for us, but she cares for us because she has a love relationship through us to a counterpart, to a masculine divine counterpart. And that masculine divine counterpart to Ma Prakriti is only accessible in a radiant explosion of possibilities. And so one needs a kind of a special jeweled lens in order to get that differential diffraction of infinite possibilities so that one could then find the mate of Mother Nature, her celestial husband. And in order for that jeweled lens to take place, the only creature in the universe, in this world, that can do that is man. So that man must learn to refine himself beyond his individuality, which satisfies his needs, his life. He has his world. He has his ritual comportment in his world. He has his culture, which is able to be tuned and participative with nature. And then he has his mind. He has his ability to come to his own individuality. But he has a task to do which is beyond himself, which is beyond his natural integral. He must learn to transform himself so that he can become that lens, that jeweled lens, that opens consciousness up from kaleidoscopic vision to the historical possibility of seeing the cosmic form. And that cosmic form can only happen if the form of yoga after karma yoga is handled in the right way. And the form of the yoga of the mind is not karma yoga. It's called jnana yoga. Jnana, jnana yoga, with a little circumflex over the end. The body ritually will do karma yoga. The mind symbolically will do a jnana yoga. And only when they're aligned in such a way that the jnana yoga is able to transform, and the signal that it is transformed is that it develops the capacity for a written language. That it makes symbols that are now not just integral, they don't just stand for and represent things in the world, but that one can read through those symbols and make imaginative pictures of something beyond this world. So when you teach children how to read, you teach them don't just look at the shapes of letters, at the shapes of words. Look through the written words to the pictures in your mind. So that as you read, you picture in your mind. This mind is not an integral mind purely, but now has a little bit of visionary consciousness. It's capable of reading the story through the language. It's called sometimes, grossly, lifting the words off the page, not just orally, but visually. And we even call it vision, visuality. When you vision through the symbols, you are able to read them, and the meaning is no longer just representational, but now the meaning becomes presentational as well. And so visionary consciousness is a presentational strategy. And what does it present? It doesn't just present what it represented before. It can do that, but it can do something else as well, of a higher order. And what it presents now is a new possibility of form. Not just to the symbolic mind, but to the individuality who lives in that mind. And that individuality now can become a differentially lensed jewel, a spiritual person. And when they do, the yoga for that is called Raja Yoga. So that Raja Yoga belongs to art. Just like Karma Yoga belongs to rituals and Jnana Yoga belongs to symbols, Raja Yoga, the king of all yogas, king, the yoga of a king. Better, because it can be a queen as well. Better to call it the royal yoga. And the royal yoga is able to bring the jnana yoga and the karma yoga not only in its alignment, but curve it around so that it becomes resonantly related. So that the strategy now is just not for geometry, but for a transform of geometry that we call trigonometry. Now you have not just a plane that has lines and angles and points, but now you have a spherical geometry that has all kinds of curves, sines and cosines, many different capacities that come up. And so visionary consciousness introduces the possibility of a trigonometric functioning, and this is where, when the trigonometric functioning comes into play in the mind, its vibrations, its waves, its process resonances interpenetrate with the processes of experience, of mythic experience. And vision and myth, when they come together in this way, they weave. And when they weave, they produce a patterning capacity for the mind for the first time. So that experience that is a linking of representation comes into a woven capacity with a vision that is resonant, and you get the patterning of symbols, and this is where written language comes from. The patterned symbol mind is capable of a written language and developing it. And when that sense of the transformed individual is able to read those symbols, read the book, that individual transforms into the spiritual person, which is a higher order, is a differential form, is a lens, and now what can be seen through that lens is an ordinal raising of the energy, a further deepening of the resonance, and this is history. So that historical consciousness now raises ordinally the power of consciousness, the power of vision, and the person who is capable of a jhana yoga now becomes capable of a fourth kind of a yoga, of a fourth quality of form, and that yoga is called Brahma Yoga. It's a cosmic yoga. And in the Bhagavad Gita, the dialogue between Krishna and Arjuna is all about Krishna maturing for the first 6 chapters, Arjuna reminding him about karma yoga, which he knows full well, taking him through 6 chapters where there's a transform, where he must understand that when he comes into his mind, into his jhana yoga, which is his heritage, as a royal figure, as the greatest, not only the greatest warrior of the day, he is also the greatest spirit warrior of the day. Because if he is fighting, he cannot lose. Because he has acquired in the Himalayas, where he went in the Mahabharata, he acquired an unstoppable power of Shiva called Pashupata, that when he shoots his arrows, they are always on the mark, they will never miss, and he will not be able to be defeated. But what stops him is that the Bhagavad Gita places him in this kind of timeless limbo pause, that the 2 great armies are facing each other on a field of battle. In Sanskrit it's called Kurukshetra. Kurus are one of the warring factions, the others are the Pandavas, and they're related, they're cousins. The 2 great armies are arrayed, the long lines of warriors with their plumes and their conch shells and their cries of battle to shatter the protective coverings of nerves of the opposite warriors. And in the midst of this din of these 2 great elephants and warriors and plumes and conch shells and spears, and are all set to pounce on each other, and at that moment Arjuna has his charioteer, who is Krishna, drive his chariot out in between the 2 armies to survey them, like a great warrior would, to show that he doesn't have to yell, he is here, he is unstoppable. The other side cannot win. As long as I fight, you lose. And as soon as he gets out there in this mode, he panics. Not on a masculine sense of karma, not on a jhana sense of his yoga particularly, but because there is something from the transcendental beyond that introduces into him a doubt. He is unable to go from Prakriti to Purusha, because only on the level of Purusha can he fight this battle, this Mahabharata. And if he fights, they win. But he cannot do this. Something has entered in, and he cannot tell what it is. Krishna must show him. Let's take a break. Let's come back to the Bhagavad Gita, and that its structure is that it is set 1/3 as the conclusion of the first third of the Mahabharata. But it not only has a structure, it has a strategy. And the strategy has something to do with the way in which our experience of nature is not only given its ordination and coordination by places on the land, stabilities like mountains or high ground or low ground, plains, but running through this landscape of structure are the rivers. and that water very often, in terms of a landscape, will be its strategic aspect, its flow. The Chinese phrase is mountains and streams without end, is the reality of the nature in which we live, our existential context, the land, the landscape. The Ganges River, when it flows through the great subcontinental landmass of India, no matter how powerful a kingdom was in ancient times, it would only control that part of the Ganges. Some other kingdom would control it before, and another would control it after. And so the river itself was like an inter-kingdom flow, showing that there was a strategy to nature that was not dominated by man's culture, not limited and fully taken over by any kingdom, and that the divine strategy of keeping India fertile for life was that the rivers flowed out of the Himalaya, and in fact the Ganges and the Brahmaputra on both ends of the Indian subcontinent come like great arms to embrace the whole of India and make it fertile. When the Ganges changed its course 5,000 years ago in a massive way, it was as if the strategy of the holiness of Mother Nature, of Prakriti, had somehow massively forced a shift, a rearrangement of all of the kingdoms and all of the cultures in that part of the world. And their vying for this was a vying that had something to do with the way in which reality itself was unfolding. The massiveness of the Mahabharata is almost beyond belief. If you took the Iliad and the Odyssey, the two classic epics of Greco-Roman Western civilization, the Mahabharata is many times as long as both of them put together. It was only in the 1780s that a British agent for the East India Company made the first translation attempt on the Bhagavad Gita, and an episode called The Churning of the Ocean from one of the books in the Mahabharata. But it was not adequately translated until late in the 19th century, and even then it was done in such a way that it was not very well presented. And so outside of India, where the Mahabharata is the national epic, it is imperfectly known. And perhaps the best short presentation was done. Peter Brook, who was a Shakespearean actor and director, undertook for the celebration of the Olympics here in Los Angeles. He undertook to mount an international development of presenting the Mahabharata in 9 hours on stage. And I was among one of those lucky persons who was able to behold the whole performance. It was held at the Raleigh Studios, the new building on off Melrose Avenue in Hollywood. And the whole soundstage, which is a huge amphitheater-like sound room to do television productions in, the entire stage was covered on the floor with sand. And the audience sat in darkness because the only light was like torch lights on the floor. And the whole back wall, up to about 40 feet, was covered with nettings that allowed various actors from time to time to climb up on the back of this, and one had this mystical setting, and the feeling was that this was going to be a very long thing, because it's going to be 3 acts of 3 hours each to present it, with only a 10-minute break in between each segment. And the 9 hours went so fast, and it was so magical and enthralling that people hung around for hours and hours after it was over. You could not leave. Peter Brook himself is one of the most magisterial figures in world drama in the 20th century. And one of his great books is The Openness of the Theater, the Open Stage. That there is a focus of structure in performance, but there is a dynamic of strategy that runs through the performance, and that when they are coordinated and brought together, they produce something called reality. It is not just something that is being represented on the stage. There is a representational element that is there, but there is a presentational elan as well. And when you can pull all of the representational things and images, the karmic acts of the rituals that have been dressed up to become ceremonial, when you can pull the ceremony of the representational stage through the shared prism of the audience and the actors together, the performance now becomes something that lenses from the shared vision of all those participating in this. It lenses something now that becomes a historical event. The Mahabharata itself is a historical event, and the way Vyasa presents it is extraordinary. There is a DVD 6 hours long of Peter Brook's Mahabharata, cut down from the 9-hour performance. My friend Jacob Needleman has read the Bhagavad Gita on audio literature tape. He did this many years ago. But the ancient story of how Vyasa came to write the Bhagavad Gita is instructive. It is a part of writing the Mahabharata. And yet, Vyasa, the sage, is a very special sage. He is the interface between an oral telling, which would be a mythological presentation, and a written symbolic presentation, which already changes then the culture to a new kind of possibility out of which will come a civilization. And one can see that the civilization that emerges in India after 300 BC becomes markedly different from what it had been before. And the huge advance and step is that about this time, the Greek invasions of Alexander the Great reached the Ganges River. They had been undefeated across the whole swath from the beginnings in Macedonia all the way to the Ganges in India. And the arrival of Alexander's unbeatable energy reminded everyone of the Mahabharata, of Alexander as a new Arjuna. And so everything was refreshed. Not only was this a retelling of ancient things, but it was of present epical changes that were going on. And the one Indian king who understood this most was named Chandragupta Maurya. And when Alexander's men refused to cross the Ganges to fight further and conquer more of India and turned back, Chandragupta Maurya, on the other side of the Ganges, realized that he could carry forward by his understanding of Alexander's new military techniques. And so he founded the Maurya dynasty, which became one of the greatest powers in India of all time. And it's proverbially that Chandragupta Maurya had 50 sons who, like the inheritors of Alexander the Great, fought among themselves once the founder was dead. And they killed each other off until the only son left was the least of the sons of Chandragupta Maurya. In fact, a grandson who was always ignored. And he was ignored because he was a half-breed. He was half Greek and half Indian, half black, half white, and he had mottled skin. And he looked very strange to people. He was halfway between two different things. Who knew what he was? And he became the inheritor of the Mauryan Empire, and he raised it to the highest level in Indian history. His name was Ashoka. And Ashokan India is like Elizabethan England, one of the highest points of civilization the world has ever seen. And Ashoka, when he conquered all of India, almost except just the southern little tip, all the way of what is Pakistan today and into Burma, he was so ashamed of having followed the Alexander the Great, Chandragupta Maurya, Mahabharata, ancient war to take over and to get an empire, that he had a revelation, a vision. And the vision came to him through a new power in India of insight and of understanding, a new vision, and that was Buddhism, which up until Ashoka was a very small group of very special people like the Pythagoreans, of just passing on from little group to little group, hardly more than several thousand people. Ashoka adopted Buddhism as the vision religion of his empire, and everywhere where there were major entrances into India, he erected pillars. They're called Ashokan pillars, and he put the simple rules of civilization in the new transform on those pillars. They're called the edicts of Ashoka. And at the top of the pillars, he put the lions, the 4 lions of the 4 directions. This is a royal decree, and disbanded his armies. And wherever the pillars were, he made roads that connected all these pillars together. And alongside the roads, he planted fruit trees and berry bushes and healing herbs and rest stops, and made them completely open to the public, free of charge, no tariffs. And so Ashokan India for 50 years had no army, had a free concourse of people everywhere in the Indian subcontinent. And while the pillars were at the entrances to India, there were 2 major pillars in the kingdom. One of them was where the Buddha was born, in Lumbini up near Nepal, and the other was in the city of what is today Delhi, on the bank of the Jumna River, to commemorate the ancient kingdom that won the Mahabharata War. And it was there where the Jumna and the Ganges come together, almost like the Tigris and Euphrates, where you have a Mesopotamia in the Near East, in what is today Iraq. There was a Mesopotamia, a land between the rivers of the Ganges and the Jumna, and it's there that the Mahabharata contending kingdoms fought. But when it came time in the Gupta era, right after Chandragupta Maurya, and just when Ashoka was born and a young man, is when Vyasa lived. He was filled with a vision that became symbolically structured together with a very special spiritual dynamic visionary strategy, but he was not able, though he could write, he was not able to write down the Mahabharata because it had a very special spiritual tone to it, a tone where the structure had to be perfectly matched to the strategy. The stable landscape had to be perfectly balanced with the concourse of the great rivers running through it, and to balance this on such a massive scale was beyond human capacity. But as the saying goes in the New Testament, Jesus replies to Peter one time when Peter says, "This is hardly possible for man." Jesus says, "Yes, that's right. It is impossible for man, but all things are possible for God." There are times when you let God do it, and you open yourself up to let that occur through you. So Vyasa opens himself to Brahma, and in his spirit, in his Purusha, he makes a resonance with Brahma, the Brahma Yoga, where you take your spiritual person and you tune yourself to the cosmos. And the cosmos, of course, then is tuned to you and comes to you, not as an individual, but comes back through a harmonic into your spiritual lensing. This is a quality where Vyasa, when he does this, realizes the presencing of Brahma, and he is surrounded by all these different groups of sages that he has been reciting parts of the Mahabharata to, and Brahma presences himself before him, and immediately Vyasa gets up out of the center seat of the surrounding of the groups of sages and makes it available for Brahma to take his royal seat, his cosmic divine seat. And then, in a very special way, Vyasa makes a double circumambulation of the seated presence of the divine. He circumambulates clockwise, and then he turns and circumambulates counterclockwise, and then stands with his palms joined together, the tuning of the hands so that they make a tone that is even, and through that evenness of tone, he bows his head so that the chakras all align, and in their alignment, the psycho-neural energy coming through that tuning is able to speak with his God and hear his God. And they are able to communicate through this very special strategic, structural resonance, harmonic. And Vyasa says that he is ready to recite the Mahabharata, but he cannot trust that he can write it down. And so Brahma says to him, think in your mind of Ganesha. And Ganesha, of course, is the elephant-headed god who, in a very real way, as soon as Vyasa is able to think of him, because he's thinking in reality and not just in mentality, Ganesha appears to him and becomes real. And Ganesha is known as the Lord of the obstacles, because he can overcome any and all obstacles. Brahma says, as he reascends back into his Brahma cosmos, Ganesha will be your scribe. And Ganesha then says to Vyasa, I can only be your scribe if I, taking my pen down, begin to write it, if I do not stop. When I stop, it will be over. So that I must write non-stop the entirety of the epic. which means that you must recite it completely, continuously perfect all the time. And Vyasa, being a huge sage, Purusha, is able to tune to the cosmos. The Purusha is the splendid, brilliant spirit person whose raiment is white as snow, whose countenance is burnished like 1,000 suns. And Vyasa says, I will recite and you will write as long as you only write what you understand. Which means now that they have to be perfectly tuned. If Ganesha does not understand something, he will stop. If Vyasa cannot remember continuously, he will in the composition there. So both of them must work together and perfectly have their strategic flow paired together. This is called, in my language, shared presence. That the presence is continuous and shared all the way. It's not just tuned, but is strategically flowing nonstop. And when it flows nonstop, a very special kind of a quality comes in. It is not linear. Because with a non-stop shared tuning, what happens naturally is that it begins to make a curve that is like a Mobius strip, an infinity sign. And it's an eternal ribbon. And these eternal ribbons we've run across before. In a myth section of our learning, we had 4 presentations on Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. And the central symbol of Sir Gawain, in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, is the endless knot, the infinity sign, which is from ancient India, from this time of Vyasa, carried back because of Hellenistic Greeks back into the West, and the infinity sign enters in and joins with the ancient Egyptian sacred cobras that are linked together in living time. Only in Egypt it was always the infinity sign like an accordion straight up. In India, it was that the infinity sign was this horizon, this shared presence ribbon of Vyasa and Ganesha under the aegis of Brahma Yoga to deliver this. And so the composition of the Mahabharata has all through it little special literary knots like infinity signs, so that as you read the Mahabharata, you move in your stepping not from place to place in a cardinal linearity, but you move from endless bow to endless bow in a resonance that produces a harmonic. And so the Mahabharata is a very special symphonic literature which raises the whole quality of what Sanskrit literature had been for thousands of years before that. Sanskrit literature before that was the Vedas. And the Rig Veda, especially the first of the Vedas, is made by poet-seers, but it's made in cardinal sequences that have a ritual traction. And eventually, different versions of the Rig Veda were made, and so that there were 4. The Sama Veda, the Atharva Veda, and one then had the 4 Vedas, and one of the things that Vyasa is famous for is of rearranging the 4 Vedas so that they would have this new kind of bowed structure in them. And the Mahabharata then becomes like a 5th Veda. It becomes the key, the pitch pipe by which one can hear a new music, that the ancient ritual bases of the Veda are now transformed and they become art. So that the whole basis of Sanskrit as a language when it is written is no longer a ritual karmic base, but is an artistic development of Raja Yoga. And so Sanskrit becomes a spirit royal language at the time of Vyasa. And this is exactly the time when you have the first commitment of the sayings of the Buddha, the remembered oral sutras of the Buddha written down for the first time. When the Bhagavad Gita, when the Mahabharata are first written, is when you have the first written sutras in Buddhism. They occur at the same time, at the same place. It's where written Sanskrit begins. And Vyasa is the great sage who creates this, who pioneers this technique. So that whenever after that you read a written Sanskrit, you no longer hear it in the ritual way in which it was heard before, but you read it in a new way, a shared way, so that written Sanskrit always works by pairs of lines that together make a unit called a shloka, or a paired tuned line. And of course you find this wherever written language really gets its spiritual impulse, because not only do you get a pair of lines that make a shloka, they pair and they make a quatrain. So that the form now of reading a written symbol language is that you learn to read through the structure of the pairs, but by a strategy of continuousness, of continuity. And as long as you keep the continuity of the strategy balanced with the pairing and pairing and pairing of the structure, you then acquire a new kind of mind. Instead of it being an integral mind that comes to an apex, a point, a center, you get a mind that is characterized by evenness, by equanimity, so that it now is able very easily to transform the natural plane of geometry into the celestial spheres of trigonometric functions. And so the mind now becomes a scene of a completely different ecology. It sees that nature loves this process. She embraces vision. And her existential children of objectivity very gladly embrace art. And so the mythological base of culture embraces the higher historical consciousness, which becomes history. And so as ritual gives way to art, culture gives way to civilization, and eventually the symbolic mind gives its way over to the scientific cosmos. Not to be obliterated or to be forgotten, but to give the emphasis to the other. And in doing so, when the science of the cosmos achieves its form, its differential forms, its infinite array of differential forms, it generates, because it has been given its base all the time, it itself generates something that gives out from it. And what it generates is the gift of the process of nature. And so nature is the process that comes out of the living cosmos, is its gift. And she, turning, understands that she is real because she has come with that shared presence of the cosmos. So Mother Nature and Father Cosmos not only belong together, they are together. But not just are together integrally, but they embrace together differentially as well. And so you get a new complementarity of the integral and the differential together. And so a Brahma Yoga is an enlarging to an infinite capacity of the complementarity of the Raja Yoga. The Raja Yoga expands and becomes a Brahma Yoga. One of the qualities that's there in the Mahabharata is that there is only one queen, Draupadi, and Draupadi is the daughter, the princess, of one of the kings of the nearby kingdoms, whose kingdom has been cut in half by the Kurus, who have taken over Hastinapura, its central city, and the other cousins of the would-be king who's there, who's only there initially as a regent, and only there as a regent because his father is born blind, and because the older brother, who would have been king, Pandu, has had a trauma and has given up his kingdom and gone off to live in the forest in retreats, and that he cannot do anything because a part of this is a curse, that he has had 3 sons from a wife and has a second wife, but if he embraces her, he will die. But eventually decides that he is going to embrace her, and she has twins, so he has 5 sons, but he has died. And it's the 5 sons of the rightful king who want to come back to Hastinapura and take the kingdom back from the regent, Duryodhana, and who will not give it back. And eventually everyone arranges in this giant Mahabharata, this Indian war. But though there are 5 brothers, they all are committed by the original wife when she hears that one of her sons, Arjuna, has won a contest of archery. She says, "You must share your prize with your brothers." And he says, "But my prize is Draupadi, the queen." And she says, "I have said what I have said. She must marry all 5 of you." So she has 5 husbands and 1 queen. And the 5 and the 1 together make a 6. Make a 6 quality, make a hexagon, a hexagram, make a quality of wholeness and firmness that has pairs of 3s, or has 3 pairs, has a quality where it allows for one to have a complete new kind of a structure that can make itself out of it. And yet the basis of it is bringing 1 together with a 5. And it's the 5-pointed star, like the infinity sign, that can only be made if the pen does not come off the paper. And so the Mahabharata is like the huge infinity sign that is made with the pen not coming off the paper, and yet at the same time the smaller infinity sign is the Bhagavad Gita that's within not having its pen come off the paper, which means that the writing symbol point of the mind does not break its yoga. And this is very difficult to do, because karma yoga is a yoga based on action, ritual action, and has a karma to it, which is unbreakable. You cannot break karma. The only way to come out of karma is through a higher order. And the only higher order that the mind knows is the jnana yoga, to come up through it. But it cannot come up through it just by itself. It is too impossible to make that leap. And so in between, there is a yoga of process that relates them, and that is the bhakti yoga. And the bhakti yoga is the givingness. And so the whole givingness tone of experience is the beginning of the kind of strategy that eventually will allow for the cosmos to make nature happen again. And so it is the bhakti devotion that is at the very beginning of it. In Mahayana Buddhism, the first perfection is dana, which is giving. And while you can eventually reach the perfections of dharma and the perfections of prajna, of truth and of higher consciousness, they must all begin with dana. And so one must practice charity. One must practice caritas. One must practice dana. And one must practice this bhakti, because it's the only way that the process begins on the cultural level of mythic experience. where feelings for the first time come into play, where images for the first time come into play, where language for the first time is able to be spoken. And the curious thing about spoken language is that it takes an incredible breath control to speak. You cannot speak a language unless you can modify more than 60 times a second the modulation and tuning of your breath. You cannot speak a language unless you can do that. You cannot consciously, voluntarily keep track of 60 movements per second continuously. And so you must learn to just do it. This is the bhakti yoga. You learn that you just do it. It is the practice of it. And it's not the practice on level of karma, it's practice on level of a cultural experience that allows you for the first time to speak in such a way that you not only speak to, but you hear who is speaking to you. So there is the conversation, there is the dialogue, which can be enlarged so that you have the community of those who are able to speak together. They not only speak the same language, but because of a shared bhakti, they're able to bring themselves out of the limitations of karma into the higher order of prajna. And by having understood, not just intellectually, but sentiently, that this is what we do, and if we do it this way, we can make this jump. We can then, if we make that jump, also together make that transform and go into the Raja Yoga stage. And a population, a community of people who are able to share a Raja Yoga together can engender history for real and reach the Brahma Yoga of the cosmos. We are at a point of civilization on this planet where this must be done. We cannot stay in the Karma Yoga, we cannot stay in the Jnana Yoga, and the Raja Yoga cries out for its further distillation and transform. We have already brought in enough science that if we do not continue with this, it will destroy us. Because it will not go back recursively, but it will fall back regressively. And if the scientific objectivity of civilization on this planet collapses, it will take everything with it, like the Twin Towers in 9/11. There's no way that the previous structures can withstand that kind of a tsunami, that kind of a tidal wave. So we start next week with a pair of figures in the 20th century who brought science in historical consciousness to the place where we have it now. Niels Bohr and Albert Einstein. Complementarity and relativity. The complementarity of the structure and the relativity of the strategy. And the strategicness of Einstein runs secretly through the wonderful structure of quantum mechanics. But for most of the 20th century, it was not observable because to the mind in its pure integral, it cannot be. It's an impossibility. Only to those who have been transformed by this kind of learning are able to see that they are a complementarity of evenness, of a new scale of reality for us. Already here, waiting simply to be lived. Next week.